Hello and welcome to the first episode of the Influential Times for 2021. Pleased to say that I'm joined as usual by Jack. Evening, Jack.
Hi.
My first story for this podcast is around virtual influencers. So yeah, an interesting story that I found this week. It's another one of those interesting sort of intersections between AI and marketing. I have to say I was a little bit skeptical when I first saw this story, but it's definitely sort of an area that's growing in popularity. One definition that I found when I was doing some research on this was a digital character created in computer graphic software, then given a personality defined by a first-person view of the world and made accessible on media platforms for the sake of influence. So yeah, it's an interesting kind of tactic that brands are using in terms of virtual influencers. Some of the advantages that I found were the fact that they can be used from anywhere. Obviously, they're not, affected by the pandemic and moving around and lockdowns and things like that, which we know has obviously been a challenge for the influencer marketing world. They also don't grow old. They can be used forever, and they also don't have the ability to jeopardize a brand's reputation as well. So yeah, you can see why they're becoming more popular. I also looked into one of the first virtual influencers who goes by the name of Lil Maquila. And she actually has some impressive stats. So she's actually got 2.8 million followers across her different channels. She charges $8,000 per post, and she actually has a better engagement rate than the likes of Selena Gomez and Beyonce as well. So yes, some impressive stats, and she's actually working with some big brands, the likes of Calvin Klein, Samsung, and Prada. So an interesting story there. But Jack, I'm not quite sure we'll be seeing virtual influencers in the B2B world too soon.
Yeah, I don't know. It's one of those things that if someone sort of time traveled from 1996 and you tried to explain it to them, you sort of feel like their brain would just sort of melt into sludge and pour out of their ears as you were trying to get into it. But I can kind of see why people are interested in it. It's definitely going on long enough that we can say it's not a gimmick anymore. Like clearly there is a market for this. So speaking of short-lived gimmicks, there's a good story on Vox's newsletter, The Goods, it's by Rebecca Jennings at Vox, and she's kind of written about how the sea shanty trend on TikTok ended up. It's kind of a really good example of both of kind of how successful TikTok's mechanism is, and then how these kind of niche trends get catapulted into the mainstream and almost immediately get sort of consumed and exhausted. So, by the time that kind of sea shanties were starting to show up on kind of mainstream platforms and people were starting to write up articles about it, I have to say from my kind of occasional TikTok use, I'd sort of cycled through it maybe weeks ago. And I think, yeah, the editor of The Baffler, Jess Bergman, sort of summed up how I felt about it by the time it got big by saying, if I see one more explainer about sea shanties on the teen video app, I'm going to go postal. So it was kind of is an interesting one. I think it just shows that TikTok, the internet has always done this, and sort of Tumblr and niche parts of Twitter, the kind of obscure bits of the blogosphere or Reddit have always had this ability, but TikTok seems to be able to do it faster, better, stronger, and I think probably the fact that it tends to be in video format, and that they've really shaped their sort of platform strategy around making the content shareable to other platforms really easily. None of this nonsense where if you post something to Instagram and then try and link it across to Twitter, it just looks rubbish.
Yeah.
Then they make it really easy to share. It just gets the kind of the watermark on it. Everyone knows where it's from, and it just really reinforces this sense that kind of TikTok is driving the cultural zeitgeist at the minute. So I think it's certainly whenever these things come up, it's usually provides a bit of light relief. But I think under it just tells you that sort of TikTok is really the center of gravity in online culture right now. Another big thing then that you had was this story about Review being snapped up by Twitter this week.
Yeah, an interesting story that came out this week. people perhaps might not have heard of Review. They're actually quite a small company. They're only 5 years old. They're actually a Dutch company. They've only got 6 employees, but they were acquired by Twitter. And what Review do is they kind of help writers and publishers to kind of send out editorial newsletters. And the key thing really is that they help them to maximize their revenue. So helping them to have subscriptions to their content and drive revenue that way. Obviously, Review kind of take a cut of that, and that's how they make their money. I think the interesting thing about the acquisition from Twitter is that it's another step in the direction of long form content. As we know, Twitter typically is short form content, but they have been creeping into that sort of world of long form content a little bit over the last few years. Obviously, in 2016, they stopped including links and photos in their character limit. And in 2017, they actually increased the limit to 280 from 140. So it's another step in that direction. And it seems now they want to get a slice of the action in terms of keeping people on the site rather than having to click outside of Twitter to access long form content, especially creator and influencer content. So in terms of the application in sort of influencers and in B2B, I think this will be really interesting. It definitely means that influencers can kind of leverage their Twitter following. People who've built up a large following over a number of years. It means that they can now sort of try and convert those followers into subscribers who want to get consistent content delivered to their email inbox or whatever. So it kind of helps both sides there in terms of the influencers, the creators, but also the audiences who want to, I guess, sort of cherry pick what content they want to access and even pay for. So Twitter have said that Review will remain as a standalone company, so it'll sit within Twitter, but they'll keep their sort of brand name and everything they've built up. But Twitter will be heavily investing in the growth of the platform. So watch this space. Jack, how do you think this will have an impact with the B2B influencers?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think it feels like a really neat fit. I think the direction of travel in influence and the sort of creator economy generally has been, thinking how do we monetize and how do platforms make monetization easier. The bonus story this week actually does a little bit more on this, but I'll jump into it now because it's relevant. There was a podcast with Adam Mosseri, head of Instagram, and he said something which I thought was quite revealing. It was kind of almost an aside, but he sort of said something along the lines of, it almost feels like kind of we've done something wrong when creators are sort of having to leave the ecosystem to sort of monetize their following. And you can see with things like Instagram shopping, they're trying to keep people in their ecosystem. So I thought that was kind of an interesting remark. And Twitter have been talking about a subscription option for a little while. It's good for revenue to have users that pay. So I'm sure it'll help with the stock price. But yeah, Jack Dorsey's been talking about this for a while. I kind of can't pretend I foresaw this exact move, but it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And I was actually talking to our friend Scott Guthrie about this on LinkedIn this week, and about 2 years ago he was talking about how influencers need to make sure they don't build on rented land.
Yeah.
You're vulnerable to an algorithm change on any social platform. So an interesting one. So speaking of kind of investing in creators and actually sort of spending money on them directly, Clubhouse, the kind of very buzzy audio only social app, has closed a round of funding with people like Andreessen Horowitz getting involved. I thought there's kind of two bits of this that I think are really interesting. One, they're immediately talking about creator payments. So this is something that has generally taken, organizations a long time to come to. Patreon's been around, or Patreon's kind of been around for 6-7 years now. I think 2014 was when they really started growing and expanding. But it's only in the last year, 6 months or so, we've seen like Snapchat are starting to pump loads into sort of trying to hold on to creators, giving away $1 million a day. TikTok has the creator fund. You can kind of see more of that stuff happening. So it's interesting that they've gone for it immediately and they've identified that creators are the pull. That's the reason to come into a room. I think I'm a little skeptical of how this will go. I know it's really popular. I'm sort of seeing a lot of people talking about it a lot. and their user base is growing. It's in the millions now, but I think there's kind of two big challenges. I think one, once we're allowed to all go outside again, this kind of thing just might not be quite as sort of in vogue. I don't think that means it's, they've built a terrible app and everyone will drop it, but I think it might, we might see a drop in popularity. I don't think they're going to have the same teething issues that everyone has, but it might be even more difficult. Instagram compared to Twitter has maybe found it even harder to sort of eradicate extremist, offensive, hate speech, things like that, and kind of root that out. And I think I'm already seeing problems. I'm seeing people talking about how they've got a bit of a problem on there, and because it's all audio, really, really hard to tell what's being said. But anyway, what do you feel about Clubhouse?
Yeah, I haven't really kind of looked into it too much, to be honest, Jack. So it's an interesting platform. It seems like we might have a bit of platform overload at some point. But yeah, no, interesting to see how it develops. Absolutely. Well, there we go. That is all the news that's fit to print. You'll see us again in another month. Stay safe, everyone. Like I said, there'll be a bonus story, which is a podcast interview with Adam Mosseri. In particular, the last sort of 15-20 minutes, where a lot of that stuff about the creator economy is. If you kind of want to skip ahead through the whole thing, where he's talking about election interference. So that's it. It's bye from me and Tom. Cheers. And we'll see you next month.